Novel transcript reading. We subsequently had frequent communication with the GAO from that point on to just a few days before 9/11. In my case, the main thing they were interested in was how I did the red team assessments of security as they were contemplating setting up their own team. But well-intentioned things move slowly in the federal bureaucracy, and certainly not fast enough for Steve and me. We were both having terrible feelings of dread that something horrendous was just around the corner, and the sooner we could motivate people to fix the problems in the Tombstone Agency, the better. So we kept badgering Mr. Joe and his staff on the progress they were making. Mr. Joe at one point admitted that he didn't have the authority to do anything, as he got his marching orders directly from Congress, but that he is trying to persuade the key elected personnel in Congress to take a serious look into our allegations. Well, this still wasn't good enough for us. Since Steve now lived in the DC area, he started to go to Capitol Hill directly and bang on the doors of the individual congressmen themselves. No surprise here, but we found out that if you go to Capitol Hill without a briefcase full of money and expect to have an audience with an actual elected official, forget it, with a few exceptions. But we did start having meetings with their staff meetings. And the staff are the eyes and ears of the politicians, and in some cases their brains too. Bob Monetti, whose son was killed on Pan Am 103, joined us at some of these meetings. Most of the staff members we spoke to were medium-level folks who really didn't have much authority, but were very interested in what we had to say, and they were a direct conduit to their respective congressmen. We also gave each of them their own copy of the Big Blue Book of Death. One of the documents that we added to the book was an email exchange between several of the senior managers in FAA security, in which they were making jokes about pulling the wool over the eyes of Congress in a recent official congressional hearing. The medium-level congressional staff members were aghast at this blatant display of arrogance, and they thumped their chests and stated that when their bosses found out about this, heads would roll. Somewhere in this discussion was the serious ramifications of lying to Congress. Ultimately, though, nothing ever materialized about this little tidbit. I think Congress, when it engages in its endless C-SPAN covered congressional hearings, expects bureaucrats to lie to them, so long as the lies fit within the established parameters of the mechanics of running the government. These hearings are usually nothing more than a big dog and pony show, which gives the congressman a little FaceTime on TV for their constituents. In one of those C-SPAN covered hearings I attended, I made a mental note that out of some 20 congressmen on the committee, based on their displayed name tags on their benches, only 4 congressmen were actually present during the whole hearing. The rest would come in for a few minutes, get their FaceTime asking questions, and leave. Whatever decisions were to be made by Congress had already been made, I suspect, based on the lobbying that is conducted off-camera prior to these hearings. It was Senator Chase who apparently, sarcastically, exclaimed in one congressional hearing during the Vietnam War words to the effect, "If I can't trust you on the little lies, sir," addressing McNamara, "how will I ever believe you on the big lies?" Nothing has changed since that era. Due to Steve's unflagging persistence, however, we did get the attention of several senior staff members on both the House and Senate sides of the Congress, and from both parties. These were the puppet masters of our elected officials, the ones that set the agenda for these hearings and tell the congressmen what to say, the brains behind the facade. Most of these guys were great and were very interested in what we had to say, as well as the documents we threw on their laps. With repeated visits to their respective offices, they assured us that they had had discussions with our elected officials about these very issues. But Steve and I were both becoming jaded about this whole process, and neither one of us felt that any of these clowns were going to do anything. Steve was relentless anyway. He continued collecting internal FAA documents from a score of insiders, providing more current and damning evidence of FAA's growing malfeasance. He put these new documents in a red binder, which he titled "Better Read Than Dead," and we delivered this book, all 2 inches thick of it, to the same folks who received the Blue Book, as well as new folks we were visiting. In my visits to the congressional offices, I never paid any attention as to whether they were Democrats or Republicans. I just figured, albeit naively, that they'd put the interests of their country above their party affiliation or the continuity of the bureaucracy. We did have meetings in the offices of a number of nationally recognized congressmen, some of whom would later run for president. I'm just picking one from each party. On March 6th, 2000, we had an hour-long session with the chief legal counsel for Senator John McCain. She graciously greeted us and escorted us to a back room in McCain's office and sat us down on one side of a large wooden table, she on the other. Steve always did most of the talking, with me interjecting comments every once in a while to help clear up any confusion I saw in the recipient's eyes. So Steve went into his usual spiel and offered our collective documents to the chief legal counsel. She was sitting back in her chair and was writing voraciously on a legal pad of paper, occasionally looking up at Steve or me as we made a particular point, and then she'd go back to writing. Wow, I was impressed. Most of the time, a staffer would write down the occasional note when we briefed them, but she was writing furiously the whole time. If we could get someone of McCain's stature on our side, maybe we would have a chance at preventing the calamity of 9/11. As we wrapped up our one-hour briefing, she put her pen and paper down and said, "This is all very interesting, but what do you expect us to do about it?" There was a long pause, like literally 12 to 15 seconds where no one spoke, just staring at each other across the table. She wasn't even paying any attention to us, probably just working on a speech or a recipe for tonight's dinner at home, where she probably should have stayed. Would have been much better for the country if she stayed home baking cookies. I could sense that Steve was getting ready to explode. There is no doubt that he would have reached across the table, grabbed her scrawny neck, and pulled her over the table and physically beat the briefing into her empty head. I still had to keep my job, however, and put my hand on Steve's shoulder in a symbolic gesture to hold him back. Steve once said in a joint press briefing we gave after 9/11 that he was the id and I was the superego of this team. And I immediately went into a grade school level course, which was still above her head, on our system of government. That there are 3 branches of government. Senator McCain is part of the legislative branch, and one of the responsibilities of the legislative branch is to engage in oversight, i.e. maintain accountability, over the executive branch, of which the FAA is part. And furthermore, the esteemed Senator McCain is one of the ranking members in this setup. She just glared at us. We got up and left. I recall one or both of us just saying under our breath, "Fuck this shit," as we left the building. This was the first time I started to think that if the terrorists targeted Capitol Hill, they'd probably do the country a favor, rather than killing lots of innocent folks in Main Street, USA. On the other side of the House, we had some communication with Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts, the same who subsequently ran for president and is now, as I write this, Secretary of State. Senator Kerry was the first congressman that either Steve and or I went to that wouldn't have anything to do with us, since neither one of us were one of his voter constituents. In my naivete of the time, I thought this was a pathetic excuse, especially since he had the nerve to vote in his capacity as senator on things that affect the whole country. But he just slammed the door shut in our faces. And I couldn't help but wonder if he only accepted lobbying bribe money from his constituents. At another Capitol Hill session, some no-name congressman assigned 2 new interns, a female and male, to interview us. They both looked like they were still in college, or maybe even high school, but they were very enthusiastic and bubbly. I had the impression we were the first members of the public they ever talked to in their official capacity, and they wanted to do a great job to kick off their career in politics. They escorted us to the usual big oak table in one of the back rooms of the congressman's office. As we sat down, Steve and I glanced at each other quickly. It was like, maybe we should go easy on them? But we decided to blast them with the usual briefing. We went through the whole gamut of what we'd been through. The evidence of zero security, the terrorist threat we faced, beating our heads against the wall, working through the various bureaucracies, talking to a seemingly endless series of congressional staffers and a few congressmen themselves, listening to a bunch of lame promises, and nobody was doing a goddamn thing but playing politics, and that a lot of innocent people are going to get killed because the clowns we elect into public office aren't doing squat but getting rich from lobbyists. During the course of this briefing, the bubbly demeanor of the two interns slowly started to deflate. They both had a pen and pad of paper to take notes, but they just stared at us the whole time, frozen in place. At the end of the briefing, they both had red eyes and were visibly palpitating. It appeared we totally eroded their illusion of what this republic was supposed to be, already turning into the worst traits of a democracy. If it weren't for the bars on the windows, I thought for sure the girl would have jumped out. The male intern was ready to stab himself in the neck, but building security previously took his pocket knife away. It was clear we were batting zero, dealing with the bureaucracies of the FAA, the Inspector General, and the General Accounting Office. But it was a major blow, batting zero with our elected officials. But Steve persisted. If these clowns don't want to listen, then we'd go totally out of the government chain and try to get the press to take an interest in this brewing calamity. Typically, when the press claws into an issue, then the politicians jump on the bandwagon to get their own little sound bites in the news. And it might even force their hand into actually doing something productive. So Steve spent a lot of time trying to get one news outlet after another to do a story on the sorry state of aviation security and the terrorism threat we faced. But none were the least bit interested in the evidence that Elson dumped in their laps. The press had no more foresight than our politicians and bureaucrats, with a couple of exceptions. The first was reporter Jim Morris of U.S. News and World Report. He saw something in the evidence Steve presented him, and subsequently had an article printed February 19, 2001, entitled, "Since Pan Am 103, A Facade of Security." Morris had hoped the story would be the front-page feature article of that issue, but the magazine's own bureaucracy pushed it back to a one-pager on page 28. Still, the article went into some detail of the facade of security and the threat, quoting Steve Elson by name, and one of my comments, anonymously. I had not yet become an official whistleblower and was still working behind the scenes. It even mentioned Osama bin Laden, named by the CIA director as the most immediate and serious threat to the United States. And yet, we still couldn't get Congress to do anything. Then followed the second reporter. Quite independently of us, another former FAA security employee was doing his own fighting, trying to fix the Tombstone Agency before 9/11 happened. This was Brian Sully Sullivan, his real name. Sully is a Vietnam veteran, retired Army Lieutenant Colonel who had worked for some time as an FAA special agent in Burlington, Massachusetts, and lived in Massachusetts. So he was certainly a constituent of the not-so-honorable Senator Kerry. He retired from the FAA in January of 2001 with a determination to address aviation security vulnerabilities he'd witnessed during his career with the Tombstone Agency. He, too, tried to address his concerns within the FAA chain of command to no avail, and could hardly wait to secure his retirement so he could work with the media on these issues. Sully and Steve then worked with a local TV reporter, Deborah Sherman of Fox 25 News in Boston, to plan an undercover sting, hidden camera and all, of the poor security at Boston's Logan Airport, where two of the terrorist teams began their fateful foray into history. This story first aired May 6, 2001. As usual, the FAA, airlines, and the Massachusetts Port Authority paid no attention. But Al-Qaeda, in the person of Mohammed Atta, did, as he was seen 5 days later, May 11, 2001, conducting surveillance, videotaping, and taking photographs of the very same checkpoint he would pass through 4 months later on 9/11. Sully was an unusually prescient individual, particularly considering that he had no red team experience. The day after this TV special aired, He sent a letter to Senator Kerry accurately describing the probability of multiple eventual plane hijackings and suicide terrorists crashing planes into selected targets. Sully's letter can be found as the link to an article by Paul Sperry entitled "Official: Kerry Failed to Act on Pre-9/11 Tip," which can be found on the internet as well as in the 9/11 digital archives. He asked me to hand-deliver a VCR copy of the Fox 25 report to Kerry's office, so they couldn't claim it got lost in the mail. So I went to Kerry's office the following week, reintroduced myself to the secretary, since I had previously been there in a failed attempt to get an audience with anybody, and asked to speak to their senior staffer. After a half hour of sitting on my butt, it was clear he still didn't want anything to do with me. I got up and feigned an interest in the various photographs and plaques decorating the senator's office, peeking down the corridor looking for the senior staffer, while engaging in small talk with the secretary, making glowing comments about the esteemed senator in the photos and plaques, while holding down the dry heaves. When I saw him traversing the back halls of the office, I advanced toward him, shoved the tape into his face, explained what it was and who it was from, and left. Couldn't have taken more than 10 seconds. Before the secretary could even stand up to chase me down, I was gone. Around the same time, Elson hand-delivered the tape to FAA Administrator Jane Garvey's office. Kerry did the usual congressional shuffle dance and forwarded Sully's letter to the Department of Transportation's office of the Inspector General, despite the fact that Sully warned him in his letter that going into the DOT OIG would be a waste of time, because they were part of the problem. When confronted by the press after 9/11, the senator said he contacted the GAO about the matter, but a check by Sully with the GAO showed no record of that contact. Basically, he absolved himself of any responsibility by passing the buck to someone else. We had repeatedly warned all of these clowns that working through the IG's office and GAO is a total waste of time.